أمريكا من سياستها طبعا، نحن عندما نتكلم عن أمريكا نتكلم عن جمعية خيرية، نتكلم عن قوة عظمى، قوة رأسمالية تقود الرأسمالية العالمية، فهي لها مصالح ضخمة. وبغض النظر طبعا عن مبادئ الحرية الأمريكية وتعلق الأمريكان بحرياتهم، وهذا طبعا واضح في الدستور الأمريكي اللي هو يعني جاء مباشرة بعد الدستور الفرنسي في 1783، وله أهمية كبيرة بما نص عليه الحريات، وأيضا طبيعة المجتمع الأمريكي وتعلقه بالديمقراطية. إلا أن هذا ليس معناته أنه هي أمريكا مبشر بالديمقراطية وإلى آخره، لأن المصالح هي أولا، المصالح ما يسمى في أمريكا دائما اللي هو الناشونال انترست أو المصالح القومية. والمصالح القومية الأمريكية بالنسبة لمنطقتنا هي مصلحتين بالدرجة الأساسية، هي النفط وإسرائيل. الطرح الأمريكي المؤخر خصوصا في اللي بدأ يطرحه بوش الابن ثم واصل أوباما في طرحه، وهو إشاعة الديمقراطية والإصلاحات الديمقراطية في المنطقة العربية بشكل خاص، فهذا ناتج عن أن انحطاط الأنظمة العربية بحيث استثارت الشعوب، وكلنا رأينا الانتفاضات طوال السنوات الماضية، وآخرها ما يعرف بالربيع العربي، والتي شكلت يعني هزة كبيرة للأنظمة الحليفة للولايات المتحدة في المنطقة. كثيرون يقولون أن أمريكا عندهم ازدواج معايير، العالم كله يعمل بازدواج المعايير، ما عدا ليس هناك في دولة عندها معايير الالتزام بالأخلاق والديمقراطية وحقوق الشعوب، إنما تتفاوت هذه البلدان من بلد إلى آخر. فعندما نعيب على أمريكا ازدواج المعايير، نعيب أيضا على أنظمتنا نفس الشيء ازدواج المعايير. هم يطالبون أمريكا بأن تكون مع الحق، وهم أنفسهم ليسوا مع حق شعوبهم. وأيضا عندما أمريكا، ونرى هذا الازدواجية عندما أمريكا تفتح حوار مع المعارضات مثلا في الدول العربية ومنها دول مجلس التعاون، أو تعطي بيان تعاطف مع تطلعات هذه الشعوب، أو تدعم الديمقراطية أو التحول الديمقراطي، يقولون أن هذا تدخل في الشؤون الخارجية، بينما تدخلاتهم هم في بلدان عربية أخرى لاحتواء ما يجري لا يعتبر بالنسبة لهم تدخل خارجي. يمكن النقطة العصية في الوضع أمريكا هو دعمها المطلق لإسرائيل، وهذا الشيء طبعا يتناقض مع مبادئ الحرية الأمريكية، مع حق تقرير المصير، مع كون أمريكا نفسها كانت مستعمرة وقاتلت ضد الاستعمار البريطاني وتحررت. وهذا ناتج ليس فقط عن مصالح أمريكية، ولكن بالدرجة الأساسية بسبب سيطرة اللوبي الصهيوني المؤيدين لإسرائيل إلى مفاصل الحياة الأمريكية السياسية وفي الحزبية وفي الكونغرس وفي أوساط الأكاديميين وفي أوساط الإعلام. ولذلك تشوف كل رئيس أمريكي ما عدا الاستثناءات مكبل باللوبي الصهيوني ومكبل بالكونغرس، وهذا هو المعضلة مع الولايات المتحدة. ولذلك لا نتوقع كثيرا بتغير في الموقف الأمريكي، ويجب أن لا نراهن على ذلك، إنما نراهن على أن العرب يخلقون واقع تغيير الواقع بأنفسهم، بأنها هي تعلن إلى جانب تطلعات شعب البحرين في الديمقراطية، في الإصلاحات، ونطالب بها بموقف بما ألزمت نفسها حكومة البحرين نفسها به، واللي هي توصيات بسيوني. من هذا المنطلق نحن نطالب أمريكا بأن تكون لها موقف يعني حازم تجاه كونها حليف للبحرين، تكون لها موقف تجاه ليس فقط توصيات بسيوني، بل تجاه تطلعات شعب البحرين للإصلاح الشامل، ومن أجل حكومة منتخبة، من أجل تحول ديمقراطي. يعني ليس مطروح إسقاط النظام، وإنما إصلاح عميق للنظام.
أسعد الله أوقاتكم بكل خير، وأهلا ومرحبا بكم معي في هذه الحلقة الجديدة من البحرين في نظرهم. موضوع حلقة اليوم هو سياسة أمريكا الخارجية، نناقشها مع ضيفي الأستاذ باتريك هانينغسون، الباحث الأمريكي في الجيوغرافيا السياسية. أهلا ومرحبا بكم معنا في هذه الحلقة. السيد باتريك هانغسون، أهلا ومرحبا بك معنا في هذه الحلقة من البحرين في نظرهم. أهلا بك.
شكرا.
أهلا وسهلا. كما هو معلوم أن لمنطقة الشرق الأوسط أهمية سياسية واقتصادية. السؤال: كيف تدير الإدارة الأمريكية سياستها في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، وما أبرز الاهتمامات أو ما أبرز اهتماماتها وأولوياتها؟
The U.S. manages its policies in the Middle East many different ways, but the important thing, I think, from a U.S. and also we have to also include Great Britain, because it's really an Anglo-American policy in the Middle East, because Britain has laid the foundations of the modern Middle East that we see today. They've drawn the borders. They have created the political paradigms which we see in all these different countries today. Mm-hmm. However, the U.S. is the #1 military power in the West and arguably in the world. So throughout history, the United States has always managed its interests according to its, not only its global geopolitical strategies, but in terms of its economic strategies. And the #1 piece on the economic chessboard is energy. Mm-hmm. So we have to look at the story of energy in the Middle East. We have to look at the resources. And from looking at the resources and the energy business globally, then we can kind of work out what are the U.S. interests. And chiefly these are corporate interests. Mm-hmm. So these corporate interests steer political policy. From the average person sitting on the sidelines watching the political game, as it were, they think that it's about people and it's about democracy and it's about freedom and progress. But in reality, it's not about any of these things with regards to Washington and especially with regards to London and the European Union. It's about money. Yeah. And it always has been and it always will be. So it really is about money and the control of resources coming from the region and distributing these resources globally.
كذلك لمنطقة الشرق الأوسط أهمية استراتيجية وجيوستراتيجية. يعني برأيكم ما هي أهم التحديات التي تواجهها الإدارة الأمريكية في هذا الخصوص؟
The biggest challenges the United States is going to face, and also Great Britain as well, is going to be the public's view, the global public's view of how they have administrated their foreign policy. Mm-hmm. If you look at Iraq, for instance, it's common knowledge, most Americans and most Europeans will agree, taking Iraq as an example, that they created the conditions for the conflict. They supported the leadership of Saddam Hussein for many years, and when he fell afoul of Washington and London and NATO and so forth, they decided it was going to be time to remove him. And what they did was they had to lie to their own public in this country and in America and any of the other coalition countries. They essentially had to lie to their own people to get some kind of a mandate in order to carry out a unilateral action outside of the United Nations track to attack and later to occupy the country of Iraq. Now, how the world views that, especially in the Middle East, it is somewhat worrying. And you know, in a way, they're able to get away with a certain amount of this sort of really aggressive foreign policy by paying people off. And there's different ways in which you can pay people off. You can pay political leaders off and parties with cash, mm-hmm. or you can also pay them off with the proceeds of the corporate profits mm-hmm. that will be coming under new management in that country. So now you see this is beginning to replicate itself. Obviously, with regards to Syria, mm-hmm. they can't go in directly because it's very unpopular. For the American people, they're going to look very bad, so they're using proxies. They've done this in Libya. They've done both in Libya, in a sense. They've gone in directly and used proxies. And then look at the other states like Bahrain and Iran across the Persian Gulf. This is going to be a major problem because the moral authority, in other words, this image or this view that for many years that America always had the world's best interests at heart. This is deteriorating now in the 21st century. And this should be the biggest worry for the United States and Britain. But I'll get into it later as to why I think that is happening. And it's not an accident, actually. I believe that the current conflagration in the Middle East and Central Asia is paving the way for what I would call a new world order, which I believe is being designed many, many years ago. And this is only the latest scene in a play that we're witnessing right now.
هناك دائما انتقادات وحديث يعني لا يبدو إيجابيا فيما يتعلق بالتوازن الأمريكي بين الحفاظ على المصالح الحيوية والاستراتيجية من جهة والالتزام بمبادئ حقوق الإنسان والديمقراطية من جهة أخرى. يعني هل تعتقد بأن الإدارة الأمريكية نجحت في خلق توازن بين مصالحها والتزاماتها؟
The situation right now with regards to America and Britain's obligations in terms of democracy or human rights is they're talking the talk, but they're no longer walking the walk. And in reality, there's a lot of talk coming out of think tanks in the West, charities, NGOs, and the governments themselves talking about human rights, you know, and democracy and freedom and things like this. But it makes a great speech, but the reality is, if you look at the actual policy of the West, specifically Western governments, their policy does not take into account human rights at all. And also, this isn't just something for the Middle East, this is globally. I don't believe, maybe there was a day in the past, maybe decades ago, where there, especially post-World War II, where genuinely there was a concern for international human rights and the advancement of, you know, democracy and education and health. But I think those days are long gone. If you look at the actual track record of the United States, of NATO countries, of Great Britain, it's a very poor track record with regards to human rights. And I don't believe they factor this in at all. All it is, the whole idea of human rights is public relations speak. It's something that you use to package a policy to make it look soft and make it look attractive. But really what's coming in is a blade. And it's a very aggressive foreign policy coming out of the West. And this, you know, you can call this hypocrisy. This is really a kind of we're in a kind of hypocritical stage in Western civilization where, you know, certain, you know, the governments and also using certain media channels, the large media channels, they're able to get across a line of thinking or get across ideas to the public that really have no relation to the reality on the ground. And we can see many, many examples of this, where Western governments have spent millions of their own taxpayers' money, billions in fact, to install dictators into countries that are really ruling with an iron fist. And human rights is just an afterthought. You know, America's got a problem with managing democracy in its own country, and so does Britain right now. The approval rating of the governments in this country, in the House of Commons, and also Congress and Senate in America, it is an all-time low. Voter turnout is an all-time low. So there's never been a point in history, more than today, where the governments of the US and Britain and in Europe are struggling to be relevant to their own people. So how then can they export these so-called concepts or values to a country like Bahrain, or to a country like Syria, or to a country like Iraq? The answer is they cannot.
الإدارة الأمريكية تؤكد أنها تتبنى سياسة حرية التعبير ودعم الديمقراطية في المنطقة، لكن نقاط النقد تتسع يوما بعد يوم، فازدواجية المعايير والكيل بمكيالين في التعامل مع ثورات الربيع العربي أهم ما يميز السياسة الأمريكية الآن، وهي واضحة بشكل جلي يعني. فما هو رأيك في ازدواجية المعايير التي اتهمت بها الإدارة الأمريكية مع كافة دول الربيع العربي؟
Yeah, there's definitely a double standard with regards to the Arab Spring. It's important to first point out that the Arab Spring was really a marketing, it's a marketing brand. And what the term Arab Spring, it describes what is really a political operation that happened in multiple countries nearly at the same time. Not all the same, though. The political Arab Spring, as it were, was organized well in advance of it actually happening in Tunisia and also in Egypt. There's a number of think tanks like the National Endowment for Democracy and the Open Society Institute, and there's dozens, if not hundreds, of these NGOs who created the Arab Spring, even took students from those countries out of those countries for training workshops over a year in advance of the actual event of the Arab Spring. And this was done through organizations like Updoor or Canvas, as they're called, that sprung out of the Yugoslavian breakup. Okay, and they have direct links with the Western intelligence agencies. That's well documented in multiple newspapers and magazines. But so when we talk about the Arab Spring, it's important to look at the real Arab Spring.
Yeah.
Okay, there's the engineered Western, engineered from a distance or with the hand on the outside. That's the Arab Spring in Egypt and Tunisia. Libya was not an Arab Spring. Libya was a proxy guerrilla war with a Western military intervention. Syria is a Western-backed and Gulf state-backed proxy guerrilla war. It's not an Arab Spring. This is not a pro-democracy movement. A pro-democracy movement would be something like in Czechoslovakia in 1992, where they had a Velvet Revolution, which was really a revolution that was based more on ideas and on ideology and not on shooting and violence. So, I mean, if we had a violent uprising in Great Britain, and let's say, like in Libya, the Libyan uprising began where armed gangs were setting fire to government buildings in Tripoli. Now, if that happened in Britain, what do you think would be the result? They'd probably call out the National Guard and there would be shooting. And they would call them domestic terrorists. But in the case of Libya, our Western mentality and the media and the government frame this as a Arab Spring uprising. Well, that's a misappropriation of what actually happened. So there is definitely an Arab Spring happening in Bahrain. Okay, this is a genuine Arab Spring because the fact that Bahrain is so closely allied with Washington and London, and you see an opposition movement there that's not being supported, that's not being recognized, then that's a real Arab Spring. That's a genuine Arab Spring. And we've seen a similar thing happen in Kuwait and also in places in Saudi Arabia that's not getting any media attention.
Yeah.
So it made good political capital for people like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and William Hague and David Cameron to use the events in Egypt and Tunisia as some sort of moment in history, like the Berlin Wall falling.
No.
It was good political mileage for them at that time, so they would use it and call it this pro-democracy movement, and we need to support these people and so forth. And it's all great if you're a politician, but the reality on the ground is much different. In Egypt, nothing really has changed in Egypt. The Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, SCAF, was running the country before the Arab Spring, not Mubarak. And after the Arab Spring, SCAF is still running the country. they have the Muslim Brotherhood, they have Mohammed Morsi now, but who is really in power in Egypt? There's not a massive difference from past to present. And I can go into detail on the story of that later.
Yeah. إذا ما انتقلنا سيد باتريك إلى الشأن البحريني، برأيكم أو كيف تدير الولايات المتحدة موضوعها في الصراع الدائر هناك؟ يعني الواضح بأنها تمتلك علاقة جيدة مع الطرفين، لكن السؤال الذي يطرح نفسه ما هي خطتها للتسوية السياسية هناك؟
I don't believe that the U.S. is genuinely interested in reaching any or seeing the opposition in the Bahraini government reaching any political agreement right now. And there's a big reason for that. And the reason is, right now, the Anglo-American empire, as it were, and the European countries are currently surrounding the country of Iran and putting pressure on it from the outside. And Bahrain plays a very key role in that geopolitical chessboard, not least for the fact that it's hosting the U.S. Fifth Naval Fleet just across the Persian Gulf. So to have democracy break out in Bahrain would be an absolute nightmare for Washington and London, because then the people of Bahrain might question, why are we hosting the U.S. military here? Why are we making ourselves a target if war breaks out with Iran? Because if there is a military confrontation with Iran, every single U.S. ally and every single British ally in the region could become a potential target for retaliation, especially if they're hosting a military base just across the Persian Gulf. It's a very dangerous game that's being played in the region right now. So the U.S., I don't think they want to see any reform break out in Bahrain until after they've realized whatever their plan is. And their main plan is regime change in Tehran. Okay, to get a Western-friendly, a U.S.-friendly regime in Tehran, that is their #1 priority, and also in Damascus as well, but that's another story.
إذا ما انتقلنا إلى مواقف المعارضة السياسية، فنجدها بأنها تتبنى المطالبة بالديمقراطية والتعددية السياسية واحترام حقوق الإنسان. يعني لماذا لا تقوم الإدارة الأمريكية بدعم مطالب الشعب البحريني لنيل كامل الحقوق المشروعة كما تفعل مع بعض دول الربيع العربي؟
I think, again, the U.S.'s vision for the opposition in Bahrain is to keep it in the refrigerator, as it were, to keep it on ice for a while. They might talk right now that they're interested in reform in Bahrain, but at the same time they're hosting diplomats and doing arms deals between these countries. At the same time they're torturing opposition people in prisons, and at the same time that police and even police from outside of Bahrain are being bussed into the country to beat down peaceful protests. Okay, it's a very, very bad situation in Bahrain there, and also the U.S. and Britain, for instance, they've gone down this road so far now with Bahrain, with ignoring it, because they were focused on Libya and Syria and creating their propaganda campaigns to get their own public support and coalition support behind regime change in those countries. They've spent so much time investing in those projects that they weren't keeping an eye, possibly, on the opposition in the democratic uprising in Bahrain. And also, throughout history, the West has a history of dealing with minority sects, putting them in power and dealing with them to control a majority population. In the case of Bahrain, you have a massive Sunni population in Bahrain. So they're natural allies with the Iranians. There's Shiite brothers and sisters, as it were, in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon and even in Saudi Arabia. So this is the West would like to first divide these countries amongst their religious and ethnic and tribal identities that, and then to hopefully rule and control them based on these divisions. And this is a massive problem. The West is quite, I believe, planners in Washington and London are worried because if they do attack Iran, there could be simultaneous uprisings in Shiite pockets all around the Middle East, and they will not be able to control these, especially in Iraq. This is of the biggest worry for the U.S. State Department, that they will lose control completely of Iraq after having occupied it for 8 years. And this is a direct consequence of what we're seeing with the intimidation and the potential war that is being called for with regards to Israel and the U.S. attacking unilaterally, perhaps Iran in the next year, in the next 2 years. We don't know. But a very dangerous situation. I don't think there's a it's not a high priority for Washington or London to see a pro-reform movement in Bahrain right now, or Kuwait, or Saudi Arabia, or Iraq, or anywhere.
مقارنة مع المعارضة، السلطات في البحرين متهمة بانتهاكات وتجاوزات حقوقية كبرى يعني أقرت بها واشنطن. هناك من يقول بأن حساباتها في البحرين مرتبطة بمصالحها مع الرياض، لذلك تغض النظر عن هذه الانتهاكات. يعني هل تعتقد أن الإدارة الأمريكية تغض النظر عن الانتهاكات والتجاوزات التي ترتكب بحق الشعب البحريني المظلوم؟
Yes, I believe the U.S. and Britain and Europe, they do routinely turn a blind eye to sort of state police violence against the people of Bahrain. I mean, I've seen videos of Bahraini police driving through neighborhoods and some policemen leaning out the window, shooting somebody just on the side of the street and then driving off. So literally driving through neighborhoods, shooting people and driving away. This was a few years ago. You look at how they handle their peaceful protests and what they do to people who are just ideologically protesting, not militarily. So yes, many believe that Bahrain is a satellite province of Saudi Arabia, and often the Bahraini royal family will call Riyadh to ask for help, to send in some well-trained and well-equipped police officers to put down any public unrest. That happens on a regular basis. So yes, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, all the Gulf states, these countries exist. They were cultivated. The leadership, the families who are in charge, the House of Saud, the Al Khalifi family in Bahrain, the emirs in Qatar, they're all in power because of the Britain had put them in power. Okay, Winston Churchill, while he was prime minister, was sending money, was subsidizing the formation of the House of Saud. So they would not exist. They would not be in power. These minority families and tribes would not be in power in all of these Gulf states if it were not for the British. The British laid the infrastructure for society in these emirates, okay? And they also laid the corporate infrastructure together with America in order to cultivate the economic resources from these countries till today. So the status quo, as far as the West is concerned, cannot change right now because they built that region. They put those people in power. They put the corporations in there who are even, doing joint ventures with those governments, and it's going to stay that way. So anything that threatens that, like a pro-reform movement, could turn into a democracy movement. It could, maybe the people might want to nationalize the oil industry in Bahrain, for instance, like what happened in Venezuela. And it would probably be good for the people of Bahrain, but it would be very bad for a handful of big corporations.
المعارضة البحرينية صرحت بأكثر من مرة بأنها تريد فقط الإصلاح والديمقراطية بالوسائل السلمية ولم تمارس العنف في تحركاتها. كيف تنظر الإدارة الأمريكية لنشاط المعارضة؟
I'm sure there are people in Washington, in Congress, and in the Senate that sympathize with the people of Bahrain and that take offense to the human rights violations and respect their peaceful call for democracy. I'm sure these politicians exist, but the U.S. administration in the White House is another story. They're not very interested, and never have really been in the last few decades, interested in progress and reform and human rights. They talk about it a lot. If there's something that Washington or Britain wants to acquire in terms of maybe regime change, resources, contracts, energy, oil, then they'll talk about human rights as a way to, as a key to turn to get into the region, or to get into that government. But when you see a situation like Bahrain, it's almost heartbreaking because you know, this is a real Arab Spring in Bahrain. This is, to me, in my opinion, this is the first real Arab Spring moment that hasn't been engineered by American NGOs working in a subversive way to make a political upheaval happen. This is a genuine upheaval, and these are people that are not asking for outrageous demands in terms of what's acceptable in a 21st century society. Far from it. These are very modest demands, actually. So it would be very clever if maybe the government in Bahrain would work with the opposition. It would probably make them look very good internationally, very progressive. But they've chosen to go another route so far. So it's not looking very good for them, and of course it's not looking very good for Washington or London.
العديد من المصادر تؤكد بأن الإدارة الأمريكية لا تمارس ما يكفي من الضغط على السلطات البحرينية. هل تعتقد بأن الإدارة الأمريكية تقوم يعني بتوفير إن صح التعبير غطاء دولي على الانتهاكات التي تمارسها السلطات البحرينية تجاه مواطنيها؟
Yes, there is definitely an international cover or a media cover, especially over the activities of the Bahraini government against its own citizens. You also have to remember, and people have to understand, that the United States government has a very strong influence over some of the major media networks. Particularly, we'll talk about CNN. A CNN journalist did a fantastic expose on human rights violations in Bahrain. Now, she brought this to the heads of CNN, and they buried the report. I believe her name was Amber Lyons. There's a massive scandal, but that was orders given by Washington to CNN saying, you're not going to air that documentary. You're not going to show that news report because it's too close to the truth. You know, if American people or European people see these reports of government violence in Bahrain and peaceful protesters being put down in a violent manner, if they see this on CNN, they're going to demand their government does something about it. So that's why they buried the report. So this is the Western media working with Western governments to create a version of reality for us to see. And anytime you have that, that's really a state-controlled media. It's not, you know, we don't have a free media, an uncensored media in Britain, Europe, or the United States. And in fact, it's been a long time since we actually have had that. So I do think that it's really important for people to continue to bring these issues up, even if they don't see it on the major news, or even if they don't hear their politicians talking about it. It's up to the citizens and the media consumers around the world to keep these issues alive.
هل استئناف تصدير الأسلحة للبحرين يعد ضمن الضغوط التي تمارسها الإدارة الأمريكية على السلطات في البحرين؟ سؤال يسأله الشعب البحريني.
Yeah, there's a really complex game going on here with regards to arms, military arms sales to countries like Bahrain. The West is, although they support these regimes in some of these countries like Bahrain, they're also playing a double game, okay? Now, last year in December and November 2011, there were a lot of politicians from Israel and the U.S. and Britain talking very aggressively with Iran, and then Iran was talking aggressively back, and then the U.S. was running naval exercises in the Gulf, okay, and Iran responded by running their own naval exercises, and then said, we will close the Straits of Hormuz if we have to, and that will cut off a large portion of the global oil supply coming out of the Persian Gulf. Now, that essentially brought the talk very close to war. So it also drove up the price of oil per barrel to, you know, record highs in the last few years, over $100 a barrel. So by raising the threat of war, we've raised the price of oil. So it's like a cash windfall for countries even like Bahrain. So what do they do with their extra cash? Well, at the same time the oil comes up and the threats of war come up, the arms salesmen from Britain and from the US are there at the doorstep of the royal family saying, with all that extra cash you've just made because of the threat of war, well, Iran's just across the Persian Gulf. You're going to need new anti-aircraft missiles. You're going to need new radar systems. We will sell you a second-hand AWACS plane. We'll give you logistical engineering support to go with that if you can spend the money with us. So you see, there's the arms dealers are making the money, the oil companies making the money, the royal families making money. So everything's going in a nice wheel.
إذا ما انتقلت مع حضرتكم إلى موضوع التدخل السعودي ودخول درع الجزيرة، يعني برأيكم لماذا لم تمنع الإدارة الأمريكية دخول القوات السعودية ودرع الجزيرة للبحرين على الرغم من وجود الأسطول الخامس الأمريكي الذي يتخذ من المياه الإقليمية المقابلة للبحرين قاعدة له؟
If we're looking forward to a conflict with Iran, the Western and Israeli conflict with Iran, I think it's safe to say that the geopolitical and the military interests of the West are the same as those of Saudi Arabia. And therefore they would be the same as Bahrain, because Bahrain falls under the shadow of Saudi Arabia in the region. So those things that Bahrain is not able to sort out for itself, Saudi Arabia will cover the shortfall. Okay, so the policies in Riyadh are fairly parallel to the policies coming out of London, Washington, and you could even say, in a very odd way, Tel Aviv as well.
الإدارة الأمريكية أعطت، ولو أنه كما أسلفت لم يكن بضغط قوي، ولكنها أعطت النظام البحريني فرصة في أن يجري إصلاحات ويعدل من مساره، وخاصة وأن مطلب المعارضة هو إصلاح النظام، يعني وتمثل ذلك في تقرير بسيوني. ولكن الآن ما جوابكم على عدم تطبيق بسيوني بعد عام من صدوره؟
I think the BICI's report was a fantastic effort, and I think it was a very valuable piece of work which was done, led by the doctor and his team, and it's all probably very, very accurate and very accurate depiction of the situation in Bahrain. But I don't think that it's a very high priority on the list in Washington or London to implement any of the suggestions based on findings in that report, because to do that they would have to admit that they've been ignoring the problem for many years, and they would also have to admit that they're supporting a brutal, autocratic, elitist minority dictatorship in that country, which wouldn't fly very well public relations wise for the Western governments. So it's a great report, and its recommendations are valuable. They should be implemented. We have to ask ourselves why they're not being implemented, and the answer is because it's not a high priority. Real human rights, real reform is not at the top of the agenda for the Western governments. They talk about it a lot, but in reality, if it was, they would have already implemented that report. They would have already been speaking and sitting down in diplomatic and bilateral talks with the Bahraini government to sort themselves out. But, you know, at the end of the day, Bahrain is a sovereign territory, and it's going to, whoever's in charge is going to do what it likes, regardless of what any of the international communities say. That's the sad truth.
يعني برأيكم لماذا هذه المماطلة في تنفيذ التوصيات؟ يعني على ماذا يعول النظام من وراء التسويف والمماطلة والوعود ومن دون تنفيذها؟ يعني هل ثمت إجراءات فعلية أو ضغوط على الأرض مارستها الإدارة الأمريكية لحث النظام البحريني على تنفيذ توصيات لجنة بسيوني؟
I'm not aware of any diplomatic pressure that's been put on Bahrain from the U.S. administration, either in the front diplomatically or through back channels. I'm not aware. What I can look at really as a journalist or a pundit is to look at the results and look at the fruits that the tree is bearing. And in the case of Bahrain, we don't see any fruits being bared in this direction of reform, particularly that which was recommended in the BICI's report. We don't see anything coming forward. And you're going to ask yourself again, you know, why has there been any pressure exerted? Why hasn't these reforms been implemented? And, you know, the power structure in Bahrain have a very difficult situation because they're really ruling in a kind of a caste system where you have a elite class, then you have a bureaucratic class below that, then you have the working class, then you have the sort of peasant class. And it's a very structured caste system. It's kind of like a feudal system in a way. And then you have the foreign corporations working in that country as sort of the business module that locks into the economy there and makes it make money. But the ruling powers in that country are ruling on a very, very thin thread of power, and it's always in danger of snapping. So that's why in these types of countries, which some people will call petromonarchies, in these types of petromonarchies, whenever that thread is in danger of snapping, the thread they rule by, it's so thin, they will come down so hard and so fast on any democratic or reform movement, peaceful or otherwise, because they do not want to lose power. And it's a very thin veneer of power.
بعد كل هذا ألا تخاف الإدارة الأمريكية على سمعتها وأن تفقد شعبيتها من خلال سياستها في التعاطي مع مجريات الأحداث في المنطقة؟
That's a good question. I think the U.S. administration and the British administration or government should fear its reputation, you know, with regards to its decreased popularity based on its foreign policies. It should really be afraid of that. And one's going to ask the question, well, if they were afraid of their reputation being tarnished through their foreign policy, wouldn't they change their foreign policy? And they haven't. In fact, they've accelerated it in the wrong direction. And the only explanation I have, watching the workings of government and listening to political speeches all the time, is that I believe the leadership in the West has more than ever lost touch with reality. They're so detached from reality. You know, the politicians like Hillary Clinton, we'll use her name again, and William Hague, the Foreign Secretary in Britain, you know, I'm sure they're on some level very well-meaning politicians, but on another level, they've never stepped foot in a poor neighborhood in Manama. They've never visited a Palestinian refugee camp. You know, maybe they've been to Israel, but they really haven't seen Palestine, for instance. So you really wonder what their priorities are and what their real interests are. And they really, unfortunately, our political classes in the 21st century, they really spend a lot of their time and energy following money. They're following money, and many of them are very concerned about their career after politics. So they spend their whole political careers in in the West trying to line up their career after politics.
Yeah.
And so, you know, a lot of people are going to lose out while they're in power because they're really not doing the job that they should be doing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a sad trend, and we're feeling the effects of it right now.
Yeah. هل ستقبل الإدارة الأمريكية بعد كل ما قدم من تضحيات في البحرين أن يبقى الأمر على ما هو عليه؟
The U.S. administration is going to support the status quo in Bahrain. This is my opinion, my prediction. They're going to support the status quo in Bahrain as long as the war with Iran is on the table.
Yes.
Okay? The dominance in the region is at stake, so they're going to support the status quo in Bahrain. I see no recognition of any genuine reform movement before that time. But you know, these royal families and these sort of ruling elites in the Gulf should really be worried because, you know, if they allow the U.S. and Israel to topple the regime in Tehran, well, guess who's next? All of those regimes, even in Saudi Arabia, they could one day be toppled themselves by the same people who put them in power. So I think it would be more of a wise decision to really cultivate a progressive society and democracy before they themselves are tipped out of power. But that's not going to happen, and that's the whole paradox with the region and the Gulf. It's a total paradox, politically, culturally, and by that token, it's very complex as well, and very difficult to read sometimes.
طيب برأيكم هل تعطيل الحياة في البحرين بشكل كامل والاستهداف الشامل لشرائح المجتمع من أطباء ومعلمين وطلبة وموظفين يعني أمر مقبول من قبل الإدارة الأمريكية؟
It's really interesting the pursuing of intellectuals like teachers, doctors, students, and people like this by the regime in Bahrain based on their ideas or ideas they expressed. You know, the architects of U.S. foreign policy right back to the Nixon administration, you have people like Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and some of these big players in shaping UN and U.S. foreign policy. These are also the architects of very brutal regimes. For instance, this situation in Bahrain reminds me of what happened in Chile in 1973, where the U.S. government worked to overthrow the democratically elected government of Allende and replace him with General Pinochet, who was a brutal dictator. And the first thing they went for during the Pinochet regime was they went for the teachers, they went for the professors, they went for the students. Many of them disappeared or ended up in prisons and were persecuted for their ideas. But more than anything, whenever you have a truly brutal regime, Pol Pot in Cambodia was a good example of this. It was a war on the intellectual. This was the war. It was a purge. Stalin had his purges as well. Franco did the same. They would target the intellectual because they would target the artists, target the students, target the professors, because they had all the original ideas. And they had the vision of what society could become. And they were the most dangerous people. So the artist became the most dangerous man in society because he was able to articulate something new and unique.
الإدارة الأمريكية تدعم حرية التعبير والديمقراطية. برأيكم لماذا تصر السلطة على إبقاء الرموز السياسية في السجن من وراء آرائهم السياسية طبعا، وبأي وجهة حق تقوم بسحب الجنسية من بعضهم، وخاصة وأن البعض منهم ليس له أي نشاط سياسي؟
I think it's ironic that this is happening in Bahrain. They're threatening to withdraw nationality of people in Bahrain. Well, this same talking point, funny enough, is coming up within the United States itself. Now, critics of the state, they're talking about people, for instance, who are demanding states' rights in the United States. There's groups within the Washington sphere, maybe not the government itself, but the sphere, are saying, well, if you reject the federal government, then we're going to strip you of your citizenship. This isn't just a problem in Bahrain. So if the U.S. is going down this road of keeping political prisoners and torturing its own people, spying on its own people, then you can't really expect that the United States is going to run to the aid of the Bahraini people, because the United States itself is going into a more totalitarian phase right now. It's erected a massive police state. It has more people in prison per capita than any country in the world. The United States, it, in fact, is one of the most heavy states on the planet. So it's going to have, I would say it would be difficult to expect a country like the U.S. to be exporting anything progressive right now in 2012. I think America needs to probably reform itself before it can genuinely be helping other people around the world. The U.S., you know, what you see in Bahrain is a reflection of what is happening in the U.S. is happening in Britain. In Great Britain, we need to apply for a permit to protest. We need to go to the police and ask permission to make a statement in public. Now, 30 years ago, people would have said I was mad if I predicted that would be happening in this country. But that is actually happening in this country. So I think that's a very frightening thing for people in Bahrain, because it means that we will not really be able to help them in the West to reach their visions of a fair society, because we ourselves are losing that society right here at home.
برأيكم هل سنرى أي توجه جديد في السياسة الأمريكية فيما يتعلق بالشأن البحريني؟
I would hope to see a new American and British policy. I would like to forgive, you know, my governments for the shortfalls that they've made and for the overlooking of the genuine, you know, reform movement in Bahrain, and the fact they've ignored it. They've supported a regime that's torturing its political dissenters, that activists like Nabil Rajab is treated the way he is, that they're targeting people who are using Twitter. I would like to see that policy change, and I'd like to wipe the slate clean and say, look, we need to address this problem right now. But at the end of the day, again, you know, this country, Great Britain, is in the process of drafting legislation to restrict people's free speech on Twitter. The exact same things that you're seeing in Bahrain. So it's a very, very difficult time, and I think we're past the point now where we can really expect our government apparatuses to be functioning in a progressive way. I think people are going to need to demand it as individuals, and I think people need to start forming in the West coalitions based on political coalitions, people, not politicians, people based on common interests. Freedom of speech in the press is a good place to start. In Bahrain, they are making massive strides on the side of the opposition, and they've demonstrated that, you know, in the way that Gandhi demonstrated that the peaceful protest will reveal the true brutality of the state. Gandhi showed that through the peaceful protests, and I think the people of Bahrain have now achieved that. They've demonstrated the brutality of the state through a peaceful protest. But what next? What is the next step? You know, and in the end, I think I don't think you can put down a genuine reform movement. You can't keep it down forever. You can keep it down temporarily, and I think what we're seeing in Bahrain, it's going to be very difficult to keep it down forever. They might, you know, the people, the reform movement in Bahrain has lost the battle, but it hasn't lost the war. There's still a long way to go.
في ختام اللقاء أشكركم جزيل الشكر على وجودكم معنا في هذه الحلقة من البحرين في نظرهم. شكرا لك.
شكرا. مع السلامة.
مشاهدينا الكرام، في ختام اللقاء أشكر لكم حسن المتابعة. استودعكم الله على أمل اللقاء بكم في حلقة جديدة وضيف جديد من البحرين في نظرهم. إلى اللقاء.
تمنياتي أن نخرج من الأزمة التي نعيشها بسلام، ولأن البلد تنزلق مزيد من الانزلاق نحو العنف. شعب البحرين لم يعد يقبل بالاستمرار في الوضع اللي عاش فيه على مدى عقود، والدخول بأسرع وقت في مفاوضات ما بين الحكم والأطراف السياسية للخروج الآمن أنا أسميه من الأزمة. هذه هي تمنياتي.